8 gun laws were just blasted apart by federal courts, and most people still have no idea it happened. Rules that could have turned ordinary gun owners into criminals last year are suddenly cracking all over the country. If you own a firearm, want to buy one, or count on one for protection, this is the kind of shift that can hit your life fast. Quick question, are you subscribed yet? If not, hit subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of update you do not want to miss. What makes this so serious is that these were not tiny changes buried in paperwork. These were bans, waiting periods, age blocks, ammo rules, and agency moves that touched buying, carrying, and ownership. And the reason all of it started moving at once goes back to one Supreme Court case in 2022, a 6-3 ruling called Bruen. That case did not just tweak the rules. It changed the whole test judges now use when they look at gun laws. Before that ruling, courts often asked a simple question. Does the government say this law helps public safety? If the answer was yes, judges usually gave the government a lot of room, and the gun owner usually lost. Bruen flipped that around and said the government now has to show a real historical match from early American history, close to 1791. If officials cannot show that kind of old tradition, a modern gun law can be in deep trouble very quickly. That is why the past few years have felt like dominoes falling one after another. Judges are not looking at these laws the old way anymore, and that has changed outcomes in a huge way. Some restrictions that once looked untouchable are now getting ripped apart because they do not have strong roots in early American law. Before I reveal what one court actually did first, quick question, subscribed yet? You're going to want notifications on for this. One of the biggest hits came when a federal appeals court took aim at the federal handgun sales ban for adults age 18 to 20. For a long time, if someone in that age group walked into a licensed gun store and wanted a handgun, the answer was no. Not because that person was a criminal, and not because that person failed a background check, but simply because of age alone. A federal court looked at that and said the government did not prove that kind of age-based block matches our history. That matters because we are talking about legal adults, not children. At 18, a person can vote, sign contracts, and in many cases serve in uniform and handle weapons for the country. So judges started asking why that same adult could be barred from buying a handgun from a dealer for lawful self-defense. And once the government failed to show a strong historical pattern for that ban, the old federal rule stopped looking solid. Think about how real this is for someone living alone in a rough area. Maybe it is a 19-year-old working nights, walking to a car after dark, and wanting a legal tool for protection. Under the old rule, a licensed dealer had to turn that adult away even if everything else checked out. The court basically said a blanket age wall like that is not easy to square with the Second Amendment after Bruen. Now that does not mean every young adult in every state can do the same thing today without checking local law first. States can still have their own restrictions, and some of those are still in court fights of their own. But the federal rule taking that kind of hit sent a loud message that age limits are no longer getting an automatic pass. And when higher courts refuse to rush in and stop that trend, people notice even if the headlines stay quiet. Then another major crack showed up in California, and this time it was not about the gun itself. It was about ammunition, the part you need for the firearm to actually work as intended in a lawful setting. California had a system that demanded a background check again and again for ammo purchases, not just for the firearm purchase. Every time someone bought bullets, the state wanted another check, another delay, another barrier, even for regular lawful buyers. A federal appeals court stepped in and said that kind of ammo rule raises serious Second Amendment problems. And honestly, that makes sense when you think about it in plain language instead of legal language. If the government lets you own the firearm but makes buying ammo hard, delayed, or uncertain every single time, your right gets squeezed. A right that exists only on paper but not in practice starts to look less like a right and more like a permission slip. What made that ruling stand out even more was where it came from. The Ninth Circuit is not famous for being soft on gun restrictions, so this was not some easy expected outcome. Even there, judges looked at the record and saw a weak historical case for putting a new barrier on ammunition sales. The case still faced more court action after that, so it was not the end of the story, but the signal was loud. Next came a waiting period fight out of New Mexico, and this one hit the self-defense issue hard. A waiting period is simple. You pay for the firearm, pass what you need to pass, and then the state still makes you wait. In that case, the wait was 7 full days before the buyer could actually take the gun home. A federal appeals court said that kind of forced delay likely puts too much weight on the right itself. That matters most when danger is not hypothetical. Picture someone who has already reported threats, or someone who realizes a stalker has not gone away, but gotten bolder. For that person, 7 days is not just an inconvenience on a calendar. It can feel like an eternity with real fear attached to it. The court seemed to grasp that a right tied to self-defense loses force when the law blocks access at the exact moment need becomes urgent. Still, nobody should hear that and assume every waiting period in America vanished overnight. That is not how this works, and it is exactly why people get into trouble when they rely on rumors instead of current law. One court ruling can be powerful, but state laws, other court orders, and later appeals can still shape what is allowed where you live. The lesson is not ignore the rules now. The lesson is that the rules are changing fast, and you need current facts. Then came one of the biggest fights of all, the pistol brace battle. A pistol brace started as an accessory meant to help people, including disabled veterans, control certain firearms more safely with one hand. Over time, millions of regular owners bought firearms with braces legally and openly, with no reason to think they were breaking the law. Then the federal government changed course and tried to treat many of those brace pistols like short-barreled rifles under older federal law. That was a huge deal because short-barreled rifles fall under a tougher federal system with registration, tax, and extra paperwork. So a person who bought something lawfully could suddenly be told that same setup now carried serious legal risk. For many owners, it felt like the rules moved after the game had already started, and the penalty was not small. We are talking about the kind of change that can turn normal people into targets for felony charges almost overnight. Then the courts hit back. Lawsuits piled up, judges blocked enforcement in key places, and the pressure on that rule kept building. By 2025, the government backed away, the appeal was dropped, and the brace rule was formally wiped out at the federal level. Here's something crazy. 87% of people watching right now aren't subscribed. Don't be part of that statistic. That brace fight taught a bigger lesson than just what can attach to the rear of a firearm. It showed that federal agencies do not get unlimited power to rewrite the meaning of criminal law whenever they want. Congress writes laws, agencies enforce them, and courts are increasingly stepping in when agencies try to stretch words past their plain meaning. That same idea shows up again and again in the other gun cases from this new wave. A similar clash exploded over who counts as a gun dealer under federal law. The government pushed a broader rule that could sweep in more private people who sold firearms from their personal collections. Instead of focusing on someone clearly running a business, the rule reached toward ordinary people making occasional sales. A federal judge in Alabama looked at that move and said the agency had gone too far. Why does that matter to regular gun owners? Because plenty of people are not store owners, not traffickers, and not running backroom sales operations. They are collectors, hobbyists, or people who sell a few personal firearms over time to fund another purchase or trim a safe. If the dealer label expands too far, those people can suddenly face federal penalties for behavior they never believed required a license. That court ruling did not create a free-for-all, and it should never be treated like one. Real commercial dealing still requires real compliance, and anyone trying to sell guns as a business without a license is playing with fire. But the case mattered because it pushed back on the idea that the government can stretch a rule until normal private conduct looks criminal. For many owners, that was another sign that courts are drawing harder lines around agency power. Then Illinois became another major battleground when a federal judge took aim at the state's so-called assault weapons ban. That phrase gets used a lot in politics, but the law usually targets certain semi-automatic rifles based on features and design. The judge looked at the ban and found the state had a hard time proving a solid historical tradition for banning those kinds of arms. That did not end the fight, but it cracked the wall in a very serious way. This is important because semi-automatic firearms are common, and common use matters a lot in these cases. If a firearm is widely owned by law-abiding people for legal reasons, courts pay attention to that fact. The Illinois ruling was not the final chapter, since appeals can change things, but it showed how vulnerable these bans have become. The same legal pressure has also shown up in fights over similar laws in other states, including California. And this is where a lot of people make costly mistakes. They hear that a judge struck down a ban somewhere and assume that means they can buy, build, or carry whatever they want. That is not smart, and it is not safe, because state lines, court orders, and pending appeals can leave rules in a messy place. Before buying a rifle, changing a setup, or carrying anything in public, make sure you know what your current state law actually says. Minnesota brought another major ruling, this time over public carry for adults 18 to 20. The state had blocked people in that age group from getting permits to carry handguns in public. Courts looked at that restriction and started asking the same question raised in the handgun sales case: where is the real historical support? When the answer looked weak, the age-based carry restriction also looked much harder to defend. That matters because carrying in public is not the same as owning something at home. For someone commuting late, walking through a parking lot, or heading to work before sunrise, public carry can be the whole point. If a legal adult can own a firearm but cannot carry it for lawful defense because of a broad age cutoff, courts are questioning that gap. Again, none of this means every state changed at once, but the direction of the legal pressure is clear. Then there is the bump stock ruling from the Supreme Court, and that case reached beyond one device. A bump stock uses recoil to help a semi-automatic rifle fire faster, and it became a national political flashpoint after a mass shooting. The federal agency tried to classify bump stocks as machine guns, but the Supreme Court said the law did not support that label. In simple terms, the court said the agency could not expand a criminal definition on its own without Congress changing the law. That ruling mattered for more than bump stocks. It showed judges were willing to look closely at the exact words Congress used and refuse agency shortcuts. Let me ask you something. If you care about your rights, hit that subscribe button. I'll wait. Because once you understand that case, you start to see the same pattern in braces, dealer rules, and other federal gunfights. The big story here is not 8 random court losses for the government. The big story is that one major Supreme Court shift changed how judges examine gun restrictions from the ground up. Instead of balancing rights against policy claims in a loose way, courts are now asking whether America had a close historical match. That is a much tougher test for modern restrictions that were created long after the founding era, and that new test has real teeth. A law cannot survive now just because politicians say it feels useful or because officials insist it might improve safety. The government has to do the harder work of showing that the restriction fits with this country's historical tradition of firearm regulation. If it cannot do that, the law may wobble, crack, or collapse, even if it stood for years before. That is why the legal map has become confusing for ordinary people. Some rules are getting struck down, some are being blocked temporarily, some are on appeal, and some still fully apply in certain states. So you now have 2 dangerous groups: people who still obey dead rules and people who assume every rule is dead. Both groups can get burned, just in different ways, because the truth usually depends on where you live and what case is still active. For everyday gun owners, the impact is personal, not academic. It affects whether an 18-year-old adult can buy a handgun from a dealer, whether a waiting period blocks urgent self-defense, and whether ammo access gets choked off. It affects whether someone with a braced firearm has to fear becoming a criminal because of a sudden rule rewrite from Washington. It affects whether a collector making a few lawful sales gets painted as an illegal dealer without ever opening a gun store. It also affects how people think about carrying outside the home. Young adults in some states have been told they are old enough for adult duties, but not old enough for full Second Amendment protection. Courts are now testing those age lines much harder than before, and that has big consequences for lawful carry policy. For a lot of people, this is no longer an abstract constitutional debate. It is about daily life and personal safety. The smart move right now is not panic, and it is not overconfidence. The smart move is to stay grounded, stay lawful, and understand that federal and state rules do not always move together. One state may still enforce a restriction that another court has already questioned somewhere else, and that difference matters a lot. If you are thinking about a purchase, a carry permit, a brace setup, or a private sale, current local law is everything. That is also why internet clips can be dangerous. A 20-second video might say a ban is gone, a permit rule is dead, or an accessory is legal everywhere now. But real law does not work like a slogan, and acting on half-truths can land a good person in a bad place fast. Responsible gun ownership means learning the rule as it exists today, not as someone online said it existed last week. There is another human side to this that gets lost in the legal noise. These cases are about a young adult who wants a lawful handgun for protection, or a woman facing threats who cannot afford a forced delay. They are about a veteran or disabled shooter who bought a braced firearm in good faith, then got told the rules had changed overnight. They are about ordinary owners who do not want to wake up one morning and learn a bureaucrat just turned them into suspects. None of this means every court will strike every gun law forever. Some restrictions will survive, some will be rewritten, and some may come back in narrower forms. But what has changed is the government no longer gets an easy pass just by saying a rule sounds good or feels modern. Judges are asking harder questions now, and that is why so many long-standing gun rules are suddenly under stress. So when you hear that 8 laws or rules got hammered by federal courts, do not brush that off. That includes the federal handgun sales block for 18 to 20-year-olds, the California ammo background check system, and New Mexico's waiting period. It includes the pistol brace rule, the broader dealer definition rule, Minnesota's carry age restriction, and the blow against Illinois' rifle ban. And sitting behind all of it is the Supreme Court's message that agencies cannot rewrite criminal law and history still matters. The takeaway is simple, even if the court fights or not. Your rights, your responsibilities, and the rules around what you can buy, own, or carry are shifting in real time. That means staying informed is no longer optional for serious gun owners. It is part of staying lawful and staying prepared. And it means not waiting until after a bad decision, a denied purchase, or a legal mess to find out the landscape changed. So pay attention to the pattern, not just the headlines. The pattern is that federal courts are forcing gun laws to stand on real historical ground instead of broad modern claims. When that ground is weak, restrictions are falling. And when agencies stretch their power too far, judges are pushing back harder than before. That is the story underneath every one of these rulings, and it is why this moment feels different from anything we have seen in years. At the end of the day, this is about your stake in the outcome. It is about whether the law treats your rights or like privileges that can be narrowed whenever officials decide to move the line. It is about whether lawful adults can protect themselves, whether agencies can invent crimes through rule changes, and whether courts will keep demanding real limits on government power. That fight is not over, but one thing is clear now. The ground under American gun law is moving, and every gun owner needs to know it.